Hi, y'all. My name is Mia, and I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Washington. I'm a blonde Caucasian woman wearing a blazer and a rose dress, and today I'll be talking to y'all, or yins, as they say here in Pittsburgh, about the impact of the built environment on early powered mobility access. On-time mobility is fundamental to the development of a child. Self-initiated mobility benefits a child's visual proprioception and spatial awareness. It also benefits a child's communication abilities and socio-emotional competency. In contrast, when a child does not experience self-initiated mobility, this can lead to cognitive and developmental delays, and the child may also be more isolated and develop learned dependence on their family and caregivers. But don't you fear, technology can help to support on-time mobility for young kids with disabilities, from the progression of walking to rolling. And today, we're going to be talking about powered mobility specifically. So adapted ride-on cars and the PerMobile Explorer Mini are two powered mobility options for kids here in the US to use. But sometimes they can be hard to access. What barriers exist to powered mobility use, specifically when we're talking about adapted ride-on cars? Well, sometimes the kid isn't used to being upright, right? A lot of these young kids spend a lot of their time prone. So that movement in space and that sitting upright can be uncomfortable at first. The devices sometimes can be heavy, right? If anyone's picked up an adapted ride-on car, they're a little bulky. They take up the entire trunk. I can move them myself, but I don't really like to, right? If anyone came to my poster on Thursday, they know that they require manual steering. They can be hard to turn. Families might not just have the extra time to use the device. Sometimes it's just one more thing. The adapted ride-on car isn't expensive, but commercial options are. Is there enough space to use the device? I'm from the Midwest. It snows a lot. Now I live in Seattle. It rains a lot. Weather sometimes isn't our friend. And something that's perceived as an outdoor toy sometimes isn't used outside when the weather is bad. Not all sidewalks are created equal. Hills can be hard to travel up. The two biggest barriers to adapted ride-on car use are limitations of the device and environmental factors. And today, we're going to be talking about environmental factors like space and drive surfaces and how urban accessibility relates to powered mobility use by young kids and their families. Ride-on cars are hard to navigate inside, but weather and environment also can make it harder to use outside. So we wanted to ask, how do driving habits change when a young child is driving outside versus inside of their home? This seems a little obvious, but we've never seen it. And then when families are using their ride-on car outside, we're curious about where they're going. How does the environment around them impact it? Are there fun places to drive, and does that result in them going out more? So we're going to ask, how does a child's immediate environment impact their exploration? We hypothesize that children will use their ride-on car more when they're outside, as there's more space to play and roam. We also hypothesize that children and families would use their device more when there are destinations and fun places that they could go to. So how do we answer this? We provided adapted ride-on cars to 14 families in the Western Washington area to use for a year. This is one of the longest deployments where we're quantifying how they're using the device. Families weren't given a recommended drive dosage, and instead we just told them to use it as they saw fit. We just wanted to observe how they're using it in their lives. All the children in our study were under the age of 5 and had some level of mobility impairment, such as cerebral palsy. For those of you who've never seen an adapted ride-on car, they are modified to be activated by a switch, which we typically mount on the steering wheel for the kid to easily access, but sometimes they might need a head switch or a foot switch, a sip and puff. There's all sorts of different configurations we can use. And then you can also add seating supports like armrest or backrest, and using PVC, pool noodles, kickboards, basically anything you can find at your local Target. You can even add a wagon on the back if you want to carry a vent or a kid's favorite toy. And then to quantify a child's use of the device, we put a custom data logger in each of the devices to track GPS position, switch activations, acceleration, and wheel rotation. We use the GPS data to differentiate whether the child is driving inside or outside of their home. And then we could also track where they're going when they're outside. And then we can use the wheel rotation data to determine path length, so how far they drove. So how do driving habits change when a child is driving outside versus inside their home? Well, we use the GPS data to build a geofilter to determine whether a child is inside their home, so a little gate around it, or outside in the environment. We found that there's a higher number of play sessions inside. This makes some sense, as families might have just had it sitting in the living room, and when they walk by, they can put their kid in it for a few minutes for a snack or while they're cooking dinner. But when the kiddos were playing outside, the play sessions were longer in duration, and they actively drove for a longer period of time. This might be in part due to having more places to go, which aligns with the fact that kids drove further distances when they're using their device outside of their home. So where are these kids going? We looked at how far away from their home a child drove their car. So we measured the distance from their home to the furthest drive point for each play session. What we can see here is that some kids drove at a similar location, but others varied their route and used it in a lot of different places. So if you look at P6 and P8 here, you can see that there's a big variation in that bar. And then P3 is a lot tighter in, but you can see that they take it on some explorations with those outliers going up the path. Most of our kids use their device within about 300 meters or 1,000 feet from their home. But families traveled with the device too. One of the families traveled with it on a ferry across the Puget Sound. That was a wild path to see. And one family even took it 250 kilometers from their home, which reportedly was to go camping, as we do live in the Pacific Northwest. I want to show you the drive maps of two of our kids. P2 had 20 play sessions outside with their ride-on car, and basically just drove in their driveway and in their backyard. P9, on the other hand, had only 7 play sessions with their ride-on car, but they went up and down the street in front of their home. Every kid used their device differently. But now that we're looking at these, you're probably wondering, how's where they're driving impacting how they're using it? So we asked, how does the family's neighborhood environment impact a child's exploration? We measured the relationship between a family's usage of their ride-on car and the built environment around their home using 3 metrics. The walk score, which is a measure of the walkability of a neighborhood based on the proximity to different amenities. We looked at drive maps to see if families visited third spaces. So for those of you who don't know, third spaces are places that aren't work and aren't home where you can go and socialize. So for us adults, that might be a coffee shop or a brewery. And for a family with young kids, that might be the park, the zoo, a museum, or my favorite, an ice cream shop. For our kids, we specifically looked at the nearest park and elementary school to their home, as these might have playgrounds or large spaces that would be good for driving and hanging out. And then we used data from Project Sidewalk, an open source mapping initiative to identify pedestrian accessibility issues in the environment. The walk score is determined for a neighborhood based on proximity to amenities and scored on a 0 to 100 scale. So that 70 to 100 range really means you can walk for all your errands. It looks like the city up here on your left. Now, if you're in that 50 to 70 range, you might be able to walk to the neighborhood coffee shop, but you might have to drive to the grocery. And then anything less than 50, you're really gonna have to drive everywhere. Where I live, just north of downtown Seattle, is a score of 93. I can walk to 3 coffee shops, urgent care, the pharmacy, heck, even the donut shop across the street. We looked up the walk score for each of our child's home addresses. We found that children drove further distances on average when they lived in an area with a higher walk score, which aligns with our initial thoughts that participants might drive more if they're in an area with more amenities. However, most of our participants lived in an area with a walk score of about 50 or less, which means that they're gonna have to load that ride-on car in their big family car and drive it with them to wherever they're going to explore. So I think one of the coolest thing about this study has been looking at all the maps of where our kids have used their device. So I wanna show you a few more of my favorite. So when I was growing up, we used to walk as a family to the pond near my home and feed the ducks. It's fun to see that families are still doing that. P3 had 34 play sessions outside. And most of those that we can see are just right outside of their home, but they do go around the block into the park near their home. We even see them driving at a park a little further away. So you can see right here. See if I can get this to work. No, I don't know how laser pointers work. There we go, right? You can see that they're right here, driving a little further from home, which means that they put their ride-on car in the back of the car, loaded up all the kids, drove to the park, unloaded the ride-on car, unloaded the kids, and then they went for a rock and roll, which is pretty awesome to see. And P19 had 26 play sessions outside. So we can see that they drove in the court outside of their home primarily, but they went up and down the street and around the corner to the pond near their home a few times to feed the ducks, which is fun to see. So our collaborators over in computer science at UW developed Project Sidewalk a few years back. It's an online platform that uses Google Maps to go through and identify pedestrian accessibility issues with the sidewalk. As a volunteer mapper, you can go online and identify where there are curb ramps or there are not curb ramps, trash cans, or where there are poles in the way. You can identify problems with the sidewalk, like it being all broken up, if you might have seen the construction outside. Or my favorite, a missing sidewalk. That really helps you get your score up quickly. To help us data nerds out, they recently created the Access Score, a number on a 0 to 1 scale that takes into account all the accessibility issues and features on a sidewalk segment, applies some weights, and gives us an approximate measure of the accessibility level. For me, that's just low to high. The sidewalk outside of my apartment and all the hotels around here, the conference center, would be classified as a low accessibility right now because it was all blocked off due to the construction. We can use the Access Score from Project Sidewalk to map out the accessibility of each child's immediate neighborhood. We can then couple these with their drive paths. To help give you all a reference for the environment, a child's home is shown with a star, the nearest park is shown with a square, and the nearest elementary school is shown with a triangle. We only had Project Sidewalk data available for 3 of our participants who lived in Seattle. All the data is collected manually by volunteers going online and identifying these issues. We're working on machine learning, but we're not there yet. And for those of you who don't know, Seattle's really hilly and surrounded by 2 mountain chains. P5 up here on the top lives in not a super accessible area, and Project Sidewalk doesn't currently take into account for grade, but we do know from our own experiences that they live on a pretty big hill. And there's a park between the hill and their home. And as such, we can see that they don't really travel there. Instead, they primarily drive in the accessible corner near their home. P10, on the other hand, lived in a super accessible area, and as such drove on an accessible path to their elementary school near their home over 50 times. They went on an accessible gravel path once, and then they never traveled there again. We even heard about it in our interviews. And then P5 and P17 both live near some of the biggest parks in the city, but they weren't super accessible to get there. P17 has 1 accessible street on their home, but to get to that big park on the other side of the highway, they would have had to cross it, which I don't know about you, but I don't like crossing highways. So instead of driving there, they primarily drove in the alley behind their home. In conclusion, we use adapted ride-on cars as vehicles to measure the accessibility of the built environment and their impact on the mobility of a young child. We found that children drove longer and further outside of their home than inside. And as such, we need to be considering environmental accessibility when providing any form of mobility device, whether that be crutches, a walker, a manual wheelchair, or a powered wheelchair. We also show that children drive more in pedestrian-friendly, accessible neighborhoods. And as such, helping identify an accessible place for a child to move, play, and explore can be critical in helping a family to adopt the device into their daily lives and not adding another burden onto family. Don't make it be just one more thing. To continue our investigations, we're currently working on a new data logger, which you might have seen on our poster on Thursday, that we're going to be deploying in the future in conjunction with our team at Project Sidewalk to get eyes on the sidewalks from multiple directions. We need to quantify and understand how the environment impacts everyone across the lifespan and with every form of mobility. I would like to thank my PIs, Dr. Heather Feldner and Dr. Kat Steele, as well as our collaborators on the project, Dr. Kyle Winfree and Dr. John Froehlich, for their help. And I would thank you all for listening today on this last day of this poster session. And I would gladly take any questions now.